Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Levi Rickert, the founder and publisher of Native News Online. Miigwech, thank you for spending time with us today. Today, we're going to talk about an important topic in Indian country, cancer. More specifically, we are going to discuss clinical trials and why they are so important if you have cancer and if you have family member or a member of your tribal community that has cancer. Clinical trials for cancer and their other diseases are important because they have resulted in new and effective treatments, but there's a high level of hesitancy among Native Americans to participate in clinical trials. Some of that stems from our history as Native people, and some of it stems from myths and misinformation. So today, we're going to talk about the facts, the truth about clinical trials. Because as with so many other things in Indian country, representation matters. American Indians, Alaska Native people need to be represented when they're running trials to create new drugs and new treatments. To get us started, I'd like to turn things over to my associate publisher and partner, Brian Edwards, who will get us started and introduce our speaker today. Brian.
Thank you, Levi. I'm glad to be here with you today. As always, we're going to spend a few minutes here at the start to talk about cancer in Indian country, really to provide a broader perspective, and then turn things over to our speaker, who's going to talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll follow up with some Q&A. So I want to start by saying that we are able to present today's webinar with financial support of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which is really at the forefront of the fight to cure cancer. LLS has a vision of a world without blood cancer. They are the largest nonprofit dedicated to creating a world without blood cancers. They've been around since 1949, and they've invested nearly $1.3 billion in groundbreaking research, pioneering today's innovative approaches, many of them. So as part of that, LLS is setting out to improve access to clinical trials for underrepresented patients, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Hispanic, Latinx, and people from rural communities as well. They recently awarded LLS impact research grants to fund 3 major cancer centers so they could partner with community-based hospitals and clinics. Those 3 grant recipients are the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Tennessee, and the Weill Cornell Medicine Network in New York. So today we are joined by Laura Romanstead. Laura is a nurse practitioner at LLS. She's based out of Alabama, and she joined the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society as a clinical trial nurse navigator in March of 2019. She began her career as an RN, specializing in stem cell transplantation in critical care in 2010. After completing her Master of Science in Nursing degree, she became a certified adult and gerontology nurse practitioner. Has a lot of experience caring for patients with blood cancers and undergoing radiation therapy. So as a member of the LLS Clinical Trial Support Center, she's able to draw upon her past experience to assist patients and caregivers in locating clinical trials and eliminating the barriers to clinical trial enrollment through personalized communication and support. So before we turn the webinar over to Laura, I'd like to share some statistics and information about cancer in Indian country to give you all some context. So cancer, like many other health issues, is experienced at a higher rate for American Indian and Alaska Native people than other populations. So cancer death rates for AI and AN people are actually going up and have been going up over the past 20 years versus many other populations. Cancer death rates have been going down. So AI-AN people have high burden of risk factors, as we all know, including some of these that are listed here. Next slide, please. So part of the issue is that there are both personal and tribal, and in some cases systemic barriers to cancer prevention and care. So low awareness about what the symptoms are, low awareness about what stage of cancer that a person might be at, all the way to just poor access, inability to access proper healthcare prevention program specialists or screening. Next slide, please. Part of the issue, that arises from that is that Native Americans have become very hesitant to participate in clinical trials, not just cancer, but across the board. The Urban Indian Health Institute has a great website that has several videos and a lot of information about this, but there's clearly a history of abuse and exploitation. There's mistrust amongst Native people. So clinical trial avoidance is and has been and continues to be an issue. Next slide. So because there are low participation rates in clinical trials, that can have an impact on the medicines and the treatments that are being created. So this is a quote from Gwen Nichols, who's the Chief Medical Officer of LLS. And she says really succinctly, to get the full benefits of research, you need clinical trials to reflect the diversity of the US population. That's going to kind of be a theme and a bit of information we're going to share today. So let me turn the webinar over to Laura to shatter some of the myths and misconceptions that people have about clinical trials. And then we'll be back in a little bit for some Q&A. Laura, please join us and take over the slides.
Thank you so much, Brian and Levi. I'm so grateful to be here to talk about something that is very important to patients all throughout the United States and even internationally about participating in clinical trials. So let's jump on in about clinical trials and what you should know. Just quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the things we'll go over. I'm going to give a little bit of information about blood cancer because that's what we at LLS are focusing on, and then give general information about clinical trials, some of the disparities that we're seeing in clinical trial participation, and really talk through those myths, barriers, but then also the advantages of why you should participate. And then lastly, I'm going to wrap it up with what are we doing at LLS as a commitment to our patients and caregivers to help facilitate clinical trial participation. Next slide. So briefly, what is blood cancer? I know we are all aware of lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, those, but what is blood cancer? So as you can imagine, it is a cancer that affects both the bone marrow, blood cells, lymph nodes, and other parts of the lymphatic system. So I put a diagram here so that you can see where those may be found. But essentially, as you can imagine, your blood flows throughout your entire body. And so some of these cancers are not stageable, some of them are, but they can be either acute, which means they come on suddenly, they can be very severe and aggressive, or they can be more chronic, long-term diseases that we're managing for many, many years. Overall, there are 137 different types of blood cancer. I've listed out some of the main ones, the main groupings that you may see, including leukemia, lymphoma, and myeloma. But also there are other groups that are a little bit not as well known, including myelodysplastic syndromes and myeloproliferative neoplasms. That's kind of a mouthful. Basically, these are all blood cancers, and here at LLS, we are working to help cure these blood cancers, and that's what we're focused on. As we know, blood cancer affects people of all ages, all races, all genders, all socioeconomic statuses. It does not matter, and it does not discriminate. Next slide. So that's going to bring me into the importance of clinical trials. So we know about blood cancer, and as Brian mentioned, we are seeing overall a trend and improvement in blood cancer survival. This graph shows in white Americans, but we know that there's disparities, and as he mentioned, there has been an increase in death rates in the American Indian population, and so we want to translate these improved survivals among all ethnic groups, all races. And so what we're seeing is because people are living longer, that's a result of these successful clinical trials and the new treatments that are coming from those trials. We're trending towards less toxic therapies and towards more targeted therapies, more precision medicine to improve both the quality and the quantity of life that people are seeing. But the reason we need more participation is because we're not getting good representation of our population. As you can imagine, diversity is critical because what we know is that people of different ethnic backgrounds have different responses. They all also may see different side effects. And so as a result, what we're seeing in clinical trials, the results we get are not fully representative of our population. And so it's important to talk through, weigh some of the risks and benefits of participating. There are definitely risks. There's a risk involved with any type of cancer treatment that you take, but that includes the possibility that this treatment may not work. I mean, it is a clinical trial, and that's what we're trying to figure out. But standard cancer therapy doesn't work for everyone either. There's also this fear of side effects that we just don't know how people are going to what they're going to see with the treatment. There's also a risk of this increased amount of time away from their family, their friends, their work. But that's why it's really important to see if some of those are not quite as big of a deal and don't impact your life as much, then maybe a clinical trial is the right thing for you. Some of the benefits that we see are the ability to contribute to not only present, but also future therapy, not just for you, but also for your family members, for your loved ones, for people of your community who may have a diagnosis down the road. Also, you have early access to these therapies before they're even approved and available in standard treatment options. You have the ability to sometimes receive free medicine. A lot of times in a clinical trial, the medication that's being studied is offered free of charge, which nowadays cancer therapy is so expensive, and so that is definitely an added bonus. But then one of the major things in my mind is you have access to these physicians who are on the cutting edge, who are doing the research and really know the ins and outs of the disease, and you have a front row seat to them so that they can help you and guide your cancer treatment, and have close following, close monitoring and close follow-up with them. The big thing I want to leave you with is participating in a clinical trial may not only benefit you, but also your community and your loved ones as well. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the basics of a clinical trial. We keep talking about it, but what is it? So clinical trials are carefully controlled research studies that are done by scientists, doctors, and physicians to really move forward these new therapies. The goal is to not only increase survival, increase the length of disease-free time, but also to improve quality of life and really reduce those bad side effects. And when it comes to participating in a clinical trial, there are many different inclusion and exclusion criteria that determine if the trial is a good fit for you. And that has to do with what type of disease do you have. So for example, if you have a blood cancer, you're not necessarily going to be able to participate in a clinical trial for lung cancer because it's not the same disease. They also look at things like what stage of disease do you have? How old are you? We have some clinical trials that are geared specifically towards children and some that are for older adults. And then other things that they take into consideration are what other treatments have you had for this disease, if any, and what other chronic conditions or medical diagnoses do you have? And the reason that's important is safety. We want to make sure that we're not increasing risk to the patient of causing other issues. For example, let's say someone has a heart disease and the medication that we're studying has some potential heart side effects. Well, that may not be a good fit for that patient. That's why it's really important to have these discussions with a healthcare professional so they can help guide and tailor those treatment decisions. This little diagram down at the bottom is here to further educate and let you all know. It sounds scary when you talk about participating in a clinical trial and thinking, I could be a guinea pig. This may be the first time anyone's received this medication. I want to let you know that the process of getting to a clinical trial is very long. It's lengthy. Drugs are started in development in the lab, and then they're tested time and time and time again through lots of different means in the laboratory to make sure that as much information as we can gather outside of people has been gathered. So we study them in Petri dishes, we study them in mice, we study them in all these ways to make sure that the information that we need is there. And then it goes through a rigorous process through the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. There's an application, all the information and data that we have has to be presented to them. And if that drug gets approved, which, caveat, not every drug that goes to the FDA gets approved for a clinical trial. So once it meets that application and it gets approved, then it can be studied in clinical trials. And it can take years for something to come out of the laboratory to then be safe enough to study in humans. I know there's been a lot of concern around COVID and the COVID vaccine and how did it happen so quickly. A lot of that comes from having the appropriate funding. And so that's something that we have seen shattered with the COVID pandemic is we've been able to pour a large amount of funding to help expedite a lot of the process. But also, that's not a new technology. The technology behind the vaccine has been studied in the lab for a long time, but you have to have funding and willing participants to be able to move forward this therapy. Next slide. And then, so I want to hit on one more basic when it comes to clinical trials, and that has to do with the oversight and safety. I know there's a lot of concern that when people enroll in a clinical trial, they're going to be a guinea pig. It's just going to be willy-nilly. But each clinical trial is very carefully, very thoughtfully designed. They have something called a protocol, which is a detailed summary of how the clinical trial is going to be run. It includes information about why that trial is needed, what drugs are being studied, what's the purpose, and then it includes a detailed layout of how the patients are going to be monitored, what kind of follow-up, who is eligible, how is it organized. So that is something that has to be written in stone before the clinical trial can be gotten off the ground. The other thing I want to talk about is this informed consent. So that is something as a safeguard to protect participants. Basically, it is a document that the physician, whoever the investigator is, discusses in detail with the patient, participant, caregiver, whoever's involved, where they lay out what the risks are and then also what the benefits are. They give as much information as they possibly know, but then the most important part is they give you the chance to ask questions, to know what you're facing and to really discuss if this is the best option for you. It then does require a signature. Patients sign on that line and say that we have had the ability to ask these questions and get the information that we need. Now, I say that and that sounds scary, but it is not a binding legal contract. When you sign an informed consent for a clinical trial, it does not mean you have to stay in the trial forever. Clinical trials, people remove themselves from clinical trials for many different reasons. The patient can do it, the physician can do it, the sponsor can do it. So just because you sign a consent does not mean that you are 100% committing to enroll and staying on the clinical trial forever. It may be that you don't like the side effects, so you want to stop it. It may be that the physician doesn't feel like you're responding like they want to, or it may be that something else comes along that's a better therapy and they want to put you on that one. So there's a lot of different reasons. And then the last thing I want to talk about with safety and oversight has to do with oversight from the FDA, but then also the Institutional Review Board, which is IRB. So an IRB is made up of community members, scientists who are not involved in this specific study, and they are there to provide a safeguard. Their primary concern is human rights and how people on clinical trials are being treated. Everything that goes through the clinical trial has to be reviewed by the IRB. Any adverse events that happen, like side effects, those have to be reported within certain timeframes. And then the IRB has the ability to put a trial on hold. If they are seeing trends that they want to get more information about, they can tell the researchers to stop putting patients on the trial and review it. And then any changes that happen to the protocol or to the trial itself have to be approved through the IRB. Next slide. So this is just a brief diagram of the different phases of clinical trials. I'm sure we've heard about this kind of with the COVID vaccine that's come out, that things happen in different phases. This is every clinical trial that happens occurs in a stepwise process. So as you can see, we have phase 1 through phase 4. As you can imagine, phase 1 is considered the first. Now it does not mean that it's always a brand new drug. Sometimes it's a new combination of drugs that may or may not already be approved, but they may be approved in a different disease. And so then we go to a phase 2. The goal of a phase 2 is to look at efficacy and safety. And then phase 3 is looking at standard therapies and they're comparing the new treatment to those. So we're seeing, is it better? Is it working more effectively? Are side effects lessened? And then in a phase 4, these are not the most common. We don't have a ton of these, but those happen after the drug or combo of drugs have already been FDA approved. And we're looking to expand to look in a different subset, different population, or work on some of the side effects that we see. Next slide. So I really want to dive into some of these myths. Patients come to us and give us a list of things that they've heard, but they're not always true. And so there's one thought that patients come to us saying, I can only join a trial if I don't have any other standard treatment options, which that's actually not true. Clinical trials happen at multiple different phases of the diagnosis. So it may be you're newly diagnosed and you haven't had any treatment. There could be a clinical trial. Or it may be that you got a standard treatment and your disease came back. There could be a trial for that. And then there are also clinical trials for people who don't have other options as well. We've kind of debunked this one a little bit in that clinical trials are not safe and that patients may not benefit from them. As we talked about, this is a process that is studied for years and years and years before it's even tried in humans. And it's very heavily regulated with lots of checks and balances to make sure that people are being treated safely and fairly. And obviously, we're hoping that people get benefit. But if we're not seeing the results that we want, people can be removed from the trial and go on to another therapy. This is one of the big ones, the concern about getting a placebo or a sugar pill, not getting active treatment. And I have to say, especially in cancer clinical trials, this is just not something that we see often. Now, what I mean by that is when you enroll in a clinical trial with a placebo, first of all, one of the regulations is that you have to let people know that they could receive one. So they have to know what they're getting into and what they're signing up for. The other thing about that is placebos are rarely used in these serious and life-threatening diseases like cancer. When it comes to cancer therapy, what we see most often is if there is a placebo used, then it's typically combined with an active drug. So we're not giving a pure placebo. People do receive treatment. They just may not receive what's experimental, but they are getting something that does have activity against their disease. And so that's something that people struggle with. And I will say this, there are trials that don't include placebo. And so if that's something that you're interested in, you're able to kind of talk through that with your physician and avoid a trial with a placebo. And then lastly, there's a thought that clinical trials are free. There are some pieces of the clinical trial that are covered free of charge. Typically, that's going to be the drug that's being studied, and sometimes some of the specific lab work or testing that they require. But we do typically recommend that patients participate in a clinical trial combined with their insurance because the patient still has responsibilities regarding their standard of care costs that they would have for their diagnosis. Next slide. So talking through some of the barriers, we know people don't enroll. Brian mentioned that as well. And so that comes from both the patient and the physician. As we can see, access is a big thing, whether that be access to a physical site or just financially, that they cannot afford it. Of course, the fears and mistrust absolutely comes in. And honestly, too, it's just a very complex system to navigate. And so if you're not used to this, if you don't have someone who can help walk you through it and answer the questions, there's a lot of unknowns and complexity that's just hard to understand. But then also we have some physician barriers, believe it or not. It's hard for physicians to stay on top of their practice, but then also know what's going on in clinical trials outside of their institution. Lack of time, inability to be able to identify which patients would be good for a clinical trial. And then also, to be honest, there is this fear of losing your patient, which I can kind of put that to rest. We have physicians who work together with their local oncologists and participate in clinical trials. But there are a lot of reasons why people don't enroll on clinical trials. Next slide. I want to talk next about the disparities. It's something that we've all mentioned that we know exists. There's not a whole lot of data regarding this, but we do know that age is one of the factors. As you can imagine, we have an aging population. So 2 out of 3 of our cancer patients are over 65 years old, but the vast majority of people that participate in clinical trials are younger. As we have discussed, there are definitely racial and ethnic disparities regarding access to clinical trial sites, whether it be some of these strict eligibility criteria, specifically in regards to other chronic conditions that people may have. And then there's definitely the fear and mistrust based on the history, just not trusting medical institutions and physicians in this fear of the unknown. And then there's another thing that we've noted has to do with the lower income, lower socioeconomic status is less likely to participate due to some of these indirect costs of participating in a trial. So like gas to get to and from the hospital, or lodging, a lot of parking, things like that, access to a car. So that's something that we're noting and we're working to combat. Next slide. So this just lays out what we've already talked about. We've talked about gender, so females are more likely to participate than males just by a little bit, 51 to 49. The thing I want to really talk about is the race distribution. As you'll see, the vast majority of people who participate in clinical trials are white. I believe that's 76%. And then we have about 11% of Asian descent, 7 being Black or African American, 5 being other, and then 1% being American Indian or Alaskan Native. And as you can see, it's not reflective of our population. We have a more diverse population. And so the goal is to increase participation from our minority participants and allow them to have a voice moving these cancer treatments forward. Next slide. So what are we doing? How is that being accomplished? So through the Affordable Care Act, it did provide increased Medicare coverage of these routine clinical trial costs. We're also seeing improvements in the Medicaid coverage as well. It should be coming in the next year or so. But then there's been a very big push towards kind of relaxing or easing some of these strict requirements regarding the comorbidities that patients have, whether it be having a second cancer or some of the lab work that's required. And in regards to some of the ethnic disparities, there have been some well-designed programs. So President Obama and his administration implemented this All of Us research program. That is a push towards recruiting 1 million research participants from a diverse background so that we can further develop this. And then there's organizations like LLS, patient advocacy organizations and sponsors who are offering financial support to offset a lot of these costs so that it's not as taxing to participate. Next slide. So in that regards, what is LLS doing? We have so many resources, not just in regards to clinical trials, but also financial support, educational things. So obviously, we're a part of the Clinical Trial Support Center, where our goal is to not necessarily have every patient enroll in a clinical trial, but our goal is to increase the opportunity that people have to discuss that with their physician. So we work to minimize the barriers and help people really make informed decisions about their care. We work together with the healthcare team, physicians directly, investigators, to really help you decide if that's the right option for you. And ultimately, again, we're here to educate and support so that people really take control of their treatment decisions. We also have a wonderful information resource center, which is staffed with master's trained oncology social workers, nurse educators, to help answer the questions that people have regarding their disease and the things that go along with it. And we have wonderful nutrition support, peer support, LLS community. I mean, it's ongoing. So let me get to the next slide, where we list out a lot of these. You can find these all on our LLS website, or if you want a quick one-stop shop, the best thing is to call our Information Resource Center at 1-800-955-4572. You can also chat with them online or email them. but LLS is here to help. We have resources specifically for blood cancer patients and their caregivers to help ease the burden of having a cancer diagnosis and really figuring out what's the best option for you. Next slide. So I just want to end and say thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information, but I'm looking forward to talking through some of this with you guys.
Thank you. That was very thorough, Laura. So let's get started with some Q&A. If you have questions in the audience, please let us know by typing your question in the box on the control panel, which is on your right, and we'll respond to all questions in a follow-up email. So Levi, you want to get us started with some Q&A?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Laura. It was very complete and very useful information. And I know for my own family, in the last couple of decades or so, we've had 3 people with cancer. More notably, my brother passed away of cancer 3 years ago. And when he was diagnosed, it was stage 4. And I remember my niece telling our family how her daughter, who was a teenager, said, "What happened to stage 2 and stage 3? Why did we find out so late?" So the clinical trials and bringing awareness to the Native community, which, as Brian indicated, the numbers are on an upswing for the last couple of decades, just very troubling. It's troubling to me as a Potawatomi person, and collectively as the editor of Native News Online, one of our missions is to improve lives of American Indians and Alaska Natives. So Laura, thank you very much. So I really do appreciate the LLS doing this webinar today.
Well, thank you so much. It's one of those things that you're right. The longer we live, more people are continuing to be touched by cancer. And it's one of those things that we want to work towards changing, increasing awareness of prevention so that we're not skipping those stages, stage 2, stage 3, because we do have better outcomes at earlier diagnosis with a lot of cancers. And so there are clinical trials looking at that too. There are clinical trials looking at genetic predispositions and family links so that you can help your family members prevent having that diagnosis as best we can. I'm so sorry.
Can I ask a simple question then, Laura? What are some of the symptoms of leukemia and lymphoma that somebody just might experience?
So that's tough because they're very, very broad. Leukemia and lymphoma are a little bit different from, say, our lung cancer or our colon cancer, where we don't have active screening. We don't have a way to prevent it from happening, if you will. But the symptoms that we see most commonly have to do with just generalized fatigue, overwhelming fatigue. Sometimes we see things like increased bleeding because we have a drop in platelets that help us clot. So you can have bleeding gums, you can have some little red dots show up on your legs. Those are called petechiae. And then as far as lymphoma, that one's a little bit easier in that people tend to have swollen lymph nodes. Sometimes you can feel them like up in your neck, under your jaw, and under your arms, and down in your groin. But you don't always have that. But that is one of the ones a little bit easier. So fatigue, sometimes fever, just kind of been sick a lot of times with some infections, and that's because the immune system is not working to be able to fight a lot of that off. So it's a little bit sneakier.
Can I follow up then? I mean, so what are some of the best ways for early detection?
To follow up with your primary care doctor, your family doctor often, at least having physicals once a year where you have blood work drawn. Some of these blood cancers can be they come on insidiously where you may just note like, oh, your red blood cells are low, or oh, your platelets are low, but they tend to watch them over time. And so just making sure that you're checking in with your doctor, even when you don't feel bad, getting those physicals is one of the best ways to detect something early in this regards.
Levi?
Laura, Native Americans hesitate to participate often in the clinical trials. Why is it important that they participate, and how can we overcome those hesitancies among Native people?
Absolutely. it is very important that, as you mentioned, representation matters. We're doing clinical trials and we're studying, and we know that this is not fully representative of our population. And so it's important that we see how different ethnic groups and different races can respond to different treatments, because not just American Indian and Native Alaskans, but every culture has different traditions and different ways that they live their life. And so that may affect how a treatment is effective, how it plays out. And so being able to represent yourself and your community is vastly important for us to improve survival of these blood cancers, and all cancers in general.
Thank you.
You talked a little bit, just kind of, you mentioned some of the practical matters, especially related to access, things like gas or parking, or even having, reliable car transportation. So I think one of the things you said is you're working to address those kind of practical challenges that people have to gain access. What are some of the things you're doing to address that?
So here at LLS, we have the Clinical Trial Support Center, where we are all nurses trained in oncology and clinical trials. And so we are sitting in advocacy groups. We get to participate and really get out and talk about the patient's voice and the patient's experience. But the best thing that I think patients can do is continue to tell their story. Reach out to people who may not participate, but then also, put your story out there so that others can learn from that. And I think that's the most invaluable thing. From our standpoint at LLS, we have funding that is available. We're doing our best to really reduce those. So giving money. But then from a healthcare provider standpoint, educating sponsors and pharmaceutical companies about what people are actually experiencing, how long they have to travel to get to a clinical trial site, and just really working to move these closer to people's homes is one way that we're doing that.
Levi?
Laura, trust is a big thing among Native Americans. There's probably multiple reasons why American Indians and Alaskan Natives distrust the government, institutions. How can we overcome that? We know that trust and transparency is very important to us. So how can we assure that if they're participating in clinical trials, the data, their personal information will be kept confidential?
Absolutely. I think that's a universal thing. Trust is, for me, one of the most important things. If I can't trust my physician, how do I know that I'm being treated fairly? So I think my biggest piece of advice is communication. Trust and transparency do go both ways. And so patients need to be honest with their physicians about what their goals are. Communicate what your preferences are, what your lifestyle looks like. The only way to educate them is to tell them your experience. And so I feel that when you do that, and when you find a physician who's willing to listen and have that kind of supportive relationship, it's a lot easier. The trust and transparency goes back and forth, and it really is important to communicate. And when you communicate with them, they're much more likely to communicate with you.
Thank you.
So let's talk about doctors for a minute, because you kind of touched on this as well, that there are some barriers that physicians have. But when you're dealing with doctors in concert with their patients, what are some of the misconceptions or biases that they may have about clinical trials?
So, as I kind of alluded to, physicians practice in their institution and they know what's going on there, but clinical trials happen all throughout the United States. And so let's say we have a physician practicing up in New York. They may or may not know what's going on in California, and there may be a good option for a patient there. And so that's one of the biases, is lack of time, inability to know what options are available outside of your center. But then I kind of alluded to, patients do and physicians do develop a relationship, and there's this, sadness of a loss of a patient relationship when a patient does go participate in a clinical trial. But honestly, the physician is looking out for your best interest by sending you to these places. And so I think if that was, um, you know, that's the utmost concern, then they're going to put the patient first. So those are just a few of them. Just the lack of time. Sometimes I mean, it's hard. These eligibility criteria that are listed on clinical trials are very stringent. And so we're frequently communicating with physicians to say, well, is this patient eligible? Do they meet the qualifications? And so that's another thing that physicians, there's just not the ability to know that without seeing the actual protocol. So those are just a couple of the barriers on the physician side.
Levi, you have one more question? Got time
Yes,
for a couple more.
across Indian country, Indian Health Service provides much medical care. And their mission is quite simply to raise the physical, mental, social, spiritual health of American Indians and Alaska Natives to the highest levels. So for many American Indians, the spiritual side is very, very important. How can we, what does your organization do to integrate some of those belief systems that Native Americans have? And they want to retain some of their traditional healing methodologies.
Yeah, that's something that's very important, is looking at the patient as a whole, not just who they are physically, but who they are culturally, who they are spiritually. For us personally at LLS, we have the ability to have these one-on-one conversations, whether it be with us in the Clinical Trials Support Center or with our information specialists. We actually get to talk to patients and guide them and help develop questions to ask. And so as we have that conversation, when a patient expresses that that's something very important, we can help them really figure out a way to navigate that with their physician. So I think that's one way, is just through the personal touch. But I think also by doing things like this and educating and empowering people to really speak out about what is their experience and what is important to them. That's the beauty with the way that healthcare is going, in my opinion, is it is becoming more personalized, more tailored, so that people can really express what their wishes are as far as how they live, and living well is different for every person. So communicating that with physicians, and connecting with someone who can really guide you through this healthcare journey.
Thank you. Whit.
So, Levi, I want to ask you a question actually, because one of the things that Laura said and you and I know talked about is just when you do a clinical trial, it's not just for you, it's for your community. How important is that in Indian country, do you think, Levi?
I think it's very huge. We noticed that during COVID-19, Native News Online has done hundreds of stories on covering the COVID-19 pandemic. That community is very, very important, particularly in those who are willing to take or to get the vaccine, get the vaccinations that so many Americans need right now, and we're trying to get to that immunity point within their communities. But that community is one of the things that keeps coming up in our conversations. So.
Well, thank you, Laura. I mean, very thorough and informative presentation, and great practical advice here during the Q&A. So thank you for sharing your experience and your insights and your information. And thank you, Levi, for your thoughtful and kind of personal insights. Always appreciate them. So I'd like to let everyone know in the audience, if you have any questions, you can contact a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society information specialist or a clinical trial nurse navigator by calling numbers on the screen, 1-800-955-4572. Information specialists are available 9 to 9 Eastern time. There's an email there as well that you can reach them. And then you can also learn more about the clinical trial nurse navigators at the website listed here, which is lls.org/navigation. So let us thanks again to the folks at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for their support, for the important information they shared with us today. You know, Levi used a phrase, I think Laura used it as well, that we hear a lot in Indian country, and that's that representation matters. Again, I put this quote up here from Dr. Nichols because I think it's kind of a key point in all of this, that in order for clinical trials to work and therapies and drugs to work, you have to have trials that reflect the diversity of the whole population of the country. So that includes American Indians and Alaska Natives. So I hope this has given you some useful and truthful information, something to think about if someone in your life is diagnosed with cancer or really any chronic disease. Representation does matter. So please think about clinical trials, hopefully a little differently after today. And with that, we'll wrap up today's webinar. Miigwech, thank you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.